January 1949. Nebraska roads vanish under snowdrifts climbing higher than vehicles. Rail lines are cut through walls of snow. When Tom Bentley rebuilt the Lone Oak Roadhouse after the fire in 1944, he made a choice that scandalized his neighbors. Walls built from hay bales, stacked like masonry blocks and sealed with plaster. Eastern contractors called it a grass house. They said the wolf would blow it down. Visitors driving Highway 6 couldn't believe anyone would trust a dance hall to walls made of straw, 54 by 74 feet, with a 4,000 square foot second story, supported by what they dismissed as a Three Little Pigs stunt. While conventional buildings relied on thin lumber frames with gaps that leaked heat, Bentley's walls were 23 inches thick, rectangular bales pinned with rods, wrapped in chicken wire, then sealed airtight with lime plaster. Then the blizzard campaign began. November 19th, December 29th. Then January 2nd through 5th. Roads reopened only to drift shut again. 20 people died in Nebraska alone. Operation Snowbound launched, the Army opening 87,000 miles of road to free over 150,000 people from snowbound homes. Conventional buildings with their thin walls and leaky joints became fuel-burning traps. But that grass house? The stove didn't have to fight wind pumping through the walls. What did Bentley understand about insulation, air sealing, and thermal mass that everyone else missed when they built for speed instead of the Nebraska winter? If you value stories of practical wisdom that stood the test of time, make sure to subscribe. We've got more documented accounts worth remembering. The morning of January 2nd, 1949, brought winds that turned Nebraska into a white wasteland. Snowdrifts climbed past fence posts, swallowed automobiles whole, and buried section roads so completely that even the county snowplows couldn't find them. By noon, the temperature had dropped to 18 degrees below zero, and the wind was driving snow horizontally across the prairie at sustained speeds exceeding 50 miles per hour. Rail lines that had been cleared the day before vanished under fresh drifts. The Chicago and Northwestern crews worked around the clock, cutting through walls of snow, only to watch their progress disappear behind them as the storm rebuilt what they had torn down. This wasn't Nebraska's first blizzard, and it wouldn't be the last, but it marked the beginning of a winter siege that would test every structure, every heating system, and every decision made about shelter in the months before. The storm that began on January 2nd was the third major assault in a campaign that had started on November 19th, 1948, continued through December 29th, and now threatened to isolate entire counties for weeks. Roads that had been reopened after each previous storm closed again, sometimes within hours. Train schedules became meaningless. In many areas, aircraft became the only reliable means of transportation, weather permitting. The Federal Weather Summary would later document 20 deaths in Nebraska alone during this January blizzard, but the numbers only hinted at the broader crisis developing across the Great Plains. Families in rural areas were running low on food and fuel. Livestock faced starvation as hay supplies became unreachable under the snow. The scale of the emergency would eventually prompt Governor Val Peterson to declare martial law and request federal assistance. Over 23 days, Operation Snowbound would mobilize the Army to open 87,073 miles of road and free 152,196 people from snowbound homes and communities. Yet, even as the storm reached its peak intensity, travelers brave enough to venture onto Highway 6 west of Lincoln would have noticed something unusual about one particular building. The Lone Oak Roadhouse sat 5 miles from the city limits, its modern windows and clean lines suggesting conventional construction. Inside, however, the walls told a different story. Where most buildings of the era relied on timber framing with thin board sheathing, the Lone Oak's load-bearing walls consisted of rectangular hay bales, stacked in a running bond pattern, pinned with wooden rods, and sealed with lime plaster over chicken wire mesh. The building measured 54 feet by 74 feet at its base, with a second-story dance hall spanning nearly 4,000 square feet. Its walls rose 23 inches thick, more than twice the width of conventional frame construction. The hay bales had been compressed to uniform density, positioned with the straw running vertically to maximize structural strength and bound together with metal rods driven through multiple courses. Over this framework, workers had stretched chicken wire and applied multiple coats of lime plaster, creating an envelope that was both airtight and weather-resistant. Tom Bentley and Nola Bailey had chosen this construction method not from whim, but from necessity. When the original lone oak burned down in 1944, timber was scarce and expensive. The war had consumed vast quantities of lumber for military construction, and what remained commanded premium prices. Hay bales, by contrast, were abundant and inexpensive. More importantly, they offered thermal properties that conventional framing could not match. Each bale contained thousands of tiny air pockets trapped within the compressed straw. When properly sealed, these air pockets created an insulating barrier far superior to the thin walls that characterized most rural construction. The plaster coating served as more than mere weatherproofing. It transformed the bale wall into an airtight assembly that prevented wind infiltration, the silent killer of heating. Efficiency. Without proper air sealing, even the thickest insulation becomes useless as cold air pumps through gaps and cracks, forcing heating systems to work against the outdoor temperature rather than simply maintaining indoor warmth. The lime plaster, applied in multiple coats and properly cured, created a continuous air barrier that conventional frame construction, with its inevitable gaps at joints and connections, could rarely achieve. Eastern contractors and visiting building inspectors had ridiculed the concept from the beginning. They called it a grass house, suitable perhaps for a children's fairy tale, but hardly appropriate for a serious commercial building. The Three Little Pigs comparisons were inevitable and frequent. They predicted structural failure, moisture problems, and fire hazards. Some questioned whether the walls could support the weight of a two-story structure, particularly one designed to accommodate large gatherings in the upper-level dance hall. Their skepticism reflected a broader prejudice against local solutions in favor of standardized methods imported from regions with different materials and different climate challenges. The building trades had developed around timber framing because lumber was historically abundant and workable. But Nebraska in the 1940s was not Pennsylvania in the 1800s. The Great Plains demanded different approaches, and those approaches often seemed primitive to outsiders who judged techniques by familiarity rather than performance. The winter of 1948 through 1949 would settle the argument with mathematical precision. As January's blizzard reached full intensity, the fundamental question became brutally simple. Which wall design could maintain livable indoor temperatures while minimizing fuel consumption? In conventional frame buildings, thin walls with multiple thermal bridges allowed cold to penetrate directly to the interior. Air leakage at joints and connections meant that heating systems fought not just the outdoor temperature, but active air exchange that constantly diluted warm indoor air with frigid outdoor air. The lone oak's bale walls presented a different thermal equation entirely. 23 inches of compressed straw provided an estimated thermal resistance of R33, roughly 3 times the insulating value of conventional construction. The continuous plaster coating eliminated the air infiltration that plagued frame buildings. Heat generated by the wood-burning stove stayed inside the building envelope, rather than leaking through cracks to warm the Nebraska prairie. As the storm intensified and temperatures plummeted toward 20 below zero, the true test began. Buildings across the region would either prove their worth or reveal their weaknesses. Some would consume enormous quantities of fuel while barely maintaining survivable temperatures. Others would fail entirely, forcing occupants to abandon them for emergency shelter elsewhere. But the lone oak, with its ridiculed grass house construction, prepared to demonstrate what happened when regional materials met regional climate challenges with methods designed for performance rather than convention. The fire that destroyed the original lone oak on a dry August night in 1944 left Tom Bentley and Nola Bailey with a choice that would define their next decade. Insurance money would cover replacement costs, but not at pre-war prices. Lumber that had sold for $30 per 1,000 board feet in 1940 now commanded $60 or more when it could be found at all. The war effort had consumed sawmill capacity, railcar space, and skilled carpenters. What remained went to military construction or government-prioritized housing projects. Private commercial buildings waited in line behind more urgent needs. By July 1945, With victory in Europe secured and Pacific operations winding down, Bentley decided he couldn't wait for lumber prices to stabilize or supplies to normalize. The roadhouse had provided steady income from travelers on Highway 6, and every month of delay meant lost revenue that might never be recovered. He needed a solution that worked with available materials and local labor. The answer lay in the very product that had made Nebraska prosperous: compressed prairie grass, formed into rectangular bales and stacked like masonry blocks. The technique wasn't entirely unprecedented in the region. Sandhills settlers had been building with hay bales since the early 1900s, when the combination of scarce timber and abundant grass had forced similar innovations. These earlier builders had developed methods for stacking bales in running bond patterns that distributed loads evenly, techniques for pinning courses together with wooden stakes or metal rods, and systems for protecting the organic structure from moisture through careful site selection and aggressive weatherproofing. Bentley's approach borrowed from this regional knowledge while adapting it to commercial scale. The foundation rose 18 inches above grade, built from concrete blocks that would isolate the first course of bales from ground moisture. The bales themselves measured 14 inches high, 18 inches wide, and 36 inches long when properly compressed. Each weighed between 35 and 40 pounds, dense enough to provide structural stability, but light enough for two men to handle efficiently during construction. The stacking method followed masonry principles with modifications for the organic material. Bales were laid with their long dimension parallel to the wall line, creating maximum thickness for thermal performance. Each course overlapped the joints of the course below by half a bale length, creating the running bond pattern that distributed vertical loads and prevented crack propagation. Wooden stakes, cut from local hedge posts and driven through multiple courses, pinned the wall together vertically. Metal rods, salvaged from wartime scrap drives and straightened in the roadhouse's forge, provided additional reinforcement at door and window openings. The window and door frames required careful attention to load distribution and moisture control. Bentley fabricated these from mill-sawn lumber when available, rough-sawn local timber when necessary. Each frame was embedded directly into the bale wall during construction, with bales packed tightly around the frame members to eliminate air gaps. The frames themselves were sized to carry loads from the structure above, essentially functioning as posts within the bale wall system. Eastern contractors driving Highway 6 during construction made no effort to hide their amusement. The building looked like a barn raising conducted by farmers who had confused construction materials with livestock feed. One traveling salesman from Omaha was heard to remark that he'd finally found the house that the third little pig should have built if he'd really wanted the wolf to succeed. The Three Little Pigs comparison became a running joke among visitors who understood construction only through the lens of conventional timber framing. Local building officials proved only slightly more diplomatic in their skepticism. They had no building code specifically addressing bale construction, but they expressed concerns about fire safety, structural integrity, and long-term durability. The fire concerns seemed particularly ironic given that the previous building had burned to the ground despite its conventional lumber construction, while properly plastered bale walls had proven remarkably fire-resistant in other regional examples. The structural concerns reflected unfamiliarity with load-bearing masonry principles. Critics couldn't visualize how stacked blocks, even organic ones, could support a two-story structure with a large open span on the second floor. They thought in terms of timber framing, where posts and beams carried loads and walls simply filled space between structural members. The concept of the wall itself as the load-bearing element required a different understanding of structural systems, one that most Nebraska builders hadn't encountered in their conventional training. By late 1945, the walls had risen to full height and the crucial weatherproofing phase began. This step would determine whether the structure survived its first winter or validated every skeptical prediction. The process started with chicken wire, stretched taut over the exterior bale surfaces and secured with roofing nails driven into the straw. This wire mesh would provide mechanical bonding for the plaster coating and help distribute shrinkage stresses as the organic material settled and dried. The plaster itself consisted of hydrated lime mixed with sand and water to create a workable mortar that could be troweled onto the wire mesh in thin, uniform coats. The lime served multiple functions. It provided weather resistance, created an air barrier, offered some fire protection, and gradually carbonated when exposed to carbon dioxide in the air, eventually becoming as hard as limestone itself. The first coat was applied rough and thick, worked into the wire mesh and pressed into surface irregularities in the bale faces. Subsequent coats were progressively smoother and thinner, building up a weather-resistant skin that transformed the organic wall into something that looked and performed like masonry. Interior surfaces received similar treatment with lime plaster applied directly to the bale faces without wire mesh reinforcement. The interior plaster was troweled smooth and often whitewashed for better light reflection. This interior coating was as crucial as the exterior work, since it completed the air barrier and provided a cleanable, durable surface suitable for commercial occupancy. The plastering work required timing and weather, conditions that conventional construction didn't demand. Lime plaster needed protection from direct sun and wind during curing, but also required adequate ventilation to prevent moisture accumulation within the wall assembly. Too much heat would cause rapid drying and cracking. Too much moisture would prevent proper carbonation and potentially compromise the bales themselves. The plasterers worked in cool weather when possible, covered fresh work with damp burlap, and misted the surfaces periodically during the critical first week of curing. By summer 1946, the lone oak reopened with modern windows, electric lighting, and a dance floor that could accommodate 100 couples. From the highway, it looked like any other roadside commercial building of the era. Only the unusual thickness of the windowsills and the perfect temperature control hinted at the unconventional construction hidden beneath the lime plaster coating. Visitors continued to joke about the grass house, unaware that they were experiencing the results of a building method that would prove itself when winter returned with unprecedented fury. The winter of 1948 arrived early and refused to leave. November 19th brought the first major storm system, a low-pressure front that swept down from Canada, with temperatures dropping 40 degrees in 12 hours. Snow began falling before dawn and continued for 36 hours straight, accumulating 18 inches across southeastern Nebraska. Highways closed. Rural schools dismissed early. Farmers rushed to move livestock to shelter and secure feed supplies for what meteorologists predicted would be an unusually harsh season. But November was merely reconnaissance for what followed. The December 29th storm struck with greater intensity, bringing winds that sustained 50-mile-per-hour speeds and temperatures that plummeted to 15 degrees below zero. This combination created conditions that transformed falling snow into a grinding horizontal assault that found every gap in every structure across the Great Plains. Buildings that had seemed adequately weatherized during milder winters suddenly revealed weaknesses that had gone unnoticed in previous years. The storm systems weren't random weather events, but part of a larger atmospheric pattern that meteorologists would later identify as an unusually persistent trough in the jet stream. Cold Arctic air normally confined to northern Canada was being pulled south and held in place by high-pressure systems that refused to move. The result was a winter that behaved less like seasonal weather and more like a siege, with each storm building on the damage inflicted by its predecessors. Rural families across Nebraska began to understand that this winter would test their preparations in ways that previous seasons had not. Heating systems that had proven adequate for normal cold snaps now ran continuously without achieving comfortable interior temperatures. Fuel supplies calculated for typical consumption rates disappeared faster than anticipated. Most concerning of all, the storms came in waves that prevented restocking between assaults. Roads would be cleared after each blizzard, only to close again as the next system approached. By early January, Governor Val Peterson was receiving reports from county officials that painted a picture of mounting crisis across the state's rural areas. Families were rationing heating fuel, knowing that supplies might not last until spring. Livestock operations faced catastrophic losses as hay became unreachable under successive layers of snow and ice. Small communities found themselves completely isolated when wind-driven, snow-filled road cuts faster than plows could clear them. The January 2nd through 5th storm system represented the culmination of this winter siege. Weather service stations recorded sustained winds exceeding 50 miles per hour, with gusts approaching 70. Temperatures dropped to 20 degrees below zero and remained there for consecutive days. Snow fell continuously for over 70 hours, accumulating 3 feet of new powder on top of already substantial drifts from previous storms. Under these conditions, the mathematics of heating became brutally simple. Buildings with thin walls and loose construction lost heat faster than their heating systems could replace it. Every gap in siding, every loose window frame, every imperfect joint became a pathway for frigid air to enter and warm air to escape. Conventional wood-burning stoves and furnaces, adequate for normal winter conditions, found themselves fighting not just outdoor temperatures, but active air infiltration that constantly diluted interior warmth with exterior cold. The Hartwell family, living 4 miles south of the Lone Oak in a standard frame farmhouse, discovered this reality when their heating bills tripled during December, and their indoor temperature still dropped to 45 degrees on the coldest nights. Jim Hartwell found himself feeding the furnace every 2 hours around the clock, burning through a winter's worth of split oak in 6 weeks. Even with continuous firing, ice formed on the interior walls wherever thermal bridges conducted cold through the building envelope. Similar struggles played out in hundreds of rural homes across the region. The Morrison family abandoned the upstairs of their 2-story house entirely, moving mattresses into the kitchen where body heat and cooking warmth could be concentrated in the smallest possible space. The Kowalski farm family discovered that their well house, built with single-wall construction, froze solid despite a kerosene heater running continuously inside the 8-by-10-foot structure. Meanwhile, the Lone Oak maintained interior temperatures in the mid-60s with fuel consumption that seemed almost impossible to neighboring families struggling to heat much smaller spaces. Tom Bentley's wood-burning stove, no larger or more efficient than those used in conventional buildings, kept the entire 4,000-square-foot structure comfortable while consuming roughly half the cordwood that similar-sized conventional buildings required. The difference lay in the fundamental approach to thermal control. Conventional construction treated heating as a battle against outdoor temperatures, requiring constant energy input to replace heat lost through thin walls, air leaks, and thermal bridges. The Lone Oak's bale wall system treated heating as a conservation problem, focusing on retaining generated heat rather than constantly replacing lost heat. 23-inch thick walls provided thermal resistance that simply couldn't be matched by conventional framing. More importantly, the continuous plaster coating eliminated the air infiltration that plagued standard construction. Cold wind striking the building's exterior couldn't penetrate to the interior, and warm air inside couldn't leak out through gaps and joints that didn't exist in the monolithic wall assembly. As January's blizzard reached its peak intensity, the regional power grid began failing under the combined assault of wind, ice, and unprecedented electrical demand from heating systems running beyond their design capacity. Rural areas lost power first, leaving families dependent entirely on wood heat for survival. Even in areas where electricity remained available, many heating systems proved inadequate for the extreme conditions. The crisis deepened when major transportation routes closed completely. Highway 6, normally kept clear as a priority route, became impassable when wind-driven snow filled cuts faster than state plows could clear them. The railroad line through Lincoln shut down when locomotives became snowbound in drifts that exceeded the height of engine cabs. Rural areas that had seemed merely isolated during previous storms now faced complete separation from supply networks and emergency services. On January 5th, with temperatures still at 18 below zero and no break in the weather pattern visible in meteorological forecasts, Governor Peterson made the decision to request federal assistance. The scale of the emergency had exceeded the capacity of state and local resources. What began as a harsh winter had become a natural disaster requiring military-level logistics to resolve. The call for federal help would eventually bring Operation Snowbound, a coordinated effort involving the Army Corps of Engineers, National Guard units, and civilian contractors working with military equipment to reopen transportation networks and deliver emergency supplies to isolated communities. But that assistance was still days away, and families across Nebraska faced the immediate question of whether their heating systems and fuel supplies could sustain them through the continuing siege. At the Lone Oak, that question had already been answered. While neighboring buildings consumed enormous quantities of fuel while barely maintaining survivable temperatures, The ridiculed grass house demonstrated what happened when building design matched climate reality rather than construction convention. The physics of survival became unmistakably clear on the morning of January 6th, when temperatures held steady at 22 degrees below zero, and Jim Hartwell made his third trip to the woodpile before sunrise. His conventional frame farmhouse, built with standard 2x4 stud walls and board sheathing, had consumed 4 cords of seasoned oak since December 1st. Despite this enormous fuel consumption, interior temperatures rarely exceeded 50 degrees, and ice crystals formed on the inside surfaces of exterior walls wherever thermal bridges conducted cold directly through the building envelope. The fundamental problem lay in the relationship between insulation and air sealing, two concepts that conventional construction of the era treated as separate issues rather than integrated systems. Hartwell's walls contained some insulation, newspaper, and rags stuffed between studs, but this organic fill did nothing to prevent air infiltration through gaps at joints, around windows, and wherever different materials met. Cold wind striking the building's exterior didn't just conduct heat away through thin walls, it actively pumped frigid outdoor air into the living space, while simultaneously pulling heated indoor air out through the countless small openings that characterized balloon frame construction. At the Lone Oak, Tom Bentley observed the same sub-zero temperatures with markedly different results. His wood-burning stove, fed with the same seasoned oak that neighboring families were consuming at desperate rates, maintained interior temperatures in the mid-60s while consuming roughly half the fuel that comparable conventional buildings required. The difference wasn't in the heating appliance or the fuel quality, but in how the building envelope managed thermal energy once it was generated. The hay bale walls created thermal performance through 3 distinct mechanisms working in combination. First, the compressed straw provided exceptional insulating properties through the physical structure of the grass itself. Each blade of prairie grass contained microscopic air spaces that had evolved to insulate the plant against temperature extremes. When thousands of these grass blades were compressed into dense bales, they created a matrix of tiny insulating air pockets distributed throughout the wall thickness. Laboratory testing, conducted decades later, would quantify this insulating effect with thermal resistance values ranging from R17 to R54, depending on bale density, straw type, and testing methodology. Conservative field estimates for properly constructed bale walls typically cited thermal resistance around R33 for 23-inch thick assemblies, roughly triple the insulating value that conventional frame construction could achieve with available materials and techniques of the 1940s. But insulation value alone couldn't explain the Lone Oak's superior performance during the January blizzard. The second critical mechanism involved air infiltration control, achieved through the continuous plaster coating that transformed the organic bale assembly into an essentially airtight envelope. Unlike conventional construction with its inevitable gaps at joints and connections, the monolithic plaster system eliminated the pathways through which outdoor air could infiltrate and indoor air could escape. This air sealing proved crucial under blizzard conditions when 50-mile-per-hour winds created pressure differentials that forced air movement through any available opening. In conventional buildings, these pressure differences drove cold air infiltration at windward exposures, while simultaneously creating negative pressures at leeward walls that pulled heated indoor air out through gaps and cracks. The result was active air exchange that constantly diluted interior warmth with exterior cold, regardless of insulation levels. The lime plaster coating prevented this air exchange by creating a continuous barrier that wind pressure couldn't penetrate. Cold air striking the building's exterior remained outside, while heated air inside stayed within the conditioned space. Heat generated by the wood-burning stove wasn't fighting a continuous influx of 20 below zero air. It was simply maintaining the temperature of a fixed volume of interior air that couldn't escape through an envelope designed for containment rather than ventilation. The third mechanism involved thermal mass effects created by the dense bale walls and thick plaster coating. This mass absorbed heat during firing periods and released it gradually as interior temperatures dropped, moderating temperature swings and extending the effective heating cycle of each firing. Conventional thin wall construction provided no thermal storage capacity meaning that interior temperatures rose and fell directly with heating system operation. These three mechanisms, insulation, air sealing, and thermal mass, combined to create heating efficiency that seemed impossible to neighbors struggling with conventional construction. While the Hartwell family burned through their winter wood supply by mid-January, the lone oak maintained comfortable conditions with fuel consumption that would have been adequate for mild winter weather in a conventional building. The proof became unmistakable when Harold Morrison, a neighboring farmer whose own house had become barely habitable, asked Tom Bentley for permission to measure interior temperatures and fuel consumption rates during the worst of the January blizzard. Using a mercury thermometer calibrated against the Weather Service station in Lincoln, Morrison recorded interior temperatures of 64 degrees at the Lone Oak, when his own farmhouse, heated continuously, struggled to reach 48 degrees. More telling was the fuel consumption data. Morrison carefully measured the cordwood that Bentley fed into the Lone Oak stove during a 48-hour period when temperatures remained below 15 degrees below zero. The consumption rate worked out to roughly 1/3 of a cord per week, a rate that Morrison's conventional farmhouse exceeded in 3 days under the same conditions. The economic implications were staggering. Heating fuel that cost $15 per cord in January. 1949 prices meant the difference between a winter heating bill of $60 versus $180, a savings that represented nearly 2 months' wages for most rural families. But the real significance wasn't economic, it was survival-related. Families with limited wood supplies could make their fuel last 3 times longer, potentially meaning the difference between adequate heat and dangerous cold exposure during extended isolation periods. Word of these performance differences spread through informal networks among farmers dealing with similar heating challenges. The Morrison family began spending evenings at the Lone Oak rather than attempting to heat their own home during the worst cold snaps. The Kowalski family, whose farmhouse had frozen pipes despite continuous heating, arranged to store temperature-sensitive medications and canned goods in the Lone Oak's consistently heated interior. By mid-January, the building that had been ridiculed as a grass house suitable only for fairy tales had become an informal community center for families whose conventional homes couldn't maintain livable conditions. The transformation from mockery to refuge occurred without fanfare or formal recognition, but it represented a fundamental shift in understanding about what constituted effective cold climate construction. The January blizzard had conducted an unforgiving field test of building performance under extreme conditions. Conventional construction, designed around available materials and familiar techniques rather than thermal performance, had failed that test decisively. The alternative approach, walls built like masonry from local materials and sealed against air infiltration, had not only passed the test but demonstrated efficiency levels that seemed impossible until they were measured and verified by desperate neighbors seeking solutions to their own heating crises. The transformation in attitude began quietly, without formal acknowledgement or public declarations. Harold Morrison, whose own farmhouse had proven nearly uninhabitable during the worst of the January cold, started asking Tom Bentley practical questions instead of making jokes about grass houses and fairy tale construction. How thick were the walls exactly? What type of plaster worked best for weather sealing? How did you prevent moisture problems in organic walls? The questions came from genuine need rather than idle curiosity, driven by the mathematical reality of fuel consumption and heating bills that had tripled during the harsh winter. By February, when Operation Snowbound had reopened most transportation routes and emergency supply deliveries resumed, the conversations around Lincoln had shifted from mockery to inquiry. The Eastern contractors and building inspectors who had dismissed bale construction as primitive found themselves confronted with performance data that contradicted their assumptions about proper building methods. The Lone Oak hadn't just survived the winter siege, it had demonstrated heating efficiency that conventional construction couldn't match even under normal conditions. The change became most apparent when John Patterson, a building contractor from Omaha who had previously ridiculed the grass house concept, requested a detailed tour of the Lone Oak's construction during a March business trip to Lincoln. Patterson spent 2 hours examining the bale walls, measuring thickness, testing the plaster coating, and asking technical questions about moisture control and structural load distribution. His notebook filled with sketches and measurements, as he documented methods he had never encountered in conventional trade training. Patterson's interest wasn't academic. He had clients requesting buildings that could achieve better heating efficiency, driven by fuel costs that had remained high even after the emergency ended. The winter of 48 through 49 had demonstrated that Nebraska's climate demanded construction approaches designed for thermal performance rather than simple material availability. Thin walls and loose construction that might be adequate in milder climates became life-threatening liabilities when temperatures dropped below zero for extended periods. The technical details that Patterson documented reflected methods that had been refined through trial and error by builders working with local materials and regional climate challenges. The foundation design that raised the first course of bales 18 inches above grade prevented ground moisture from wicking into the organic wall structure. The running bond stacking pattern that overlapped joints between courses distributed structural loads evenly while preventing air infiltration pathways. The wire mesh reinforcement that bonded plaster coats to bale surfaces created a composite assembly stronger than either component alone. Most importantly, Patterson learned that successful bale construction required understanding the integrated relationship between all system components. The bales provided insulation and structure, but only if kept dry through proper site drainage and roof design. The plaster provided weather protection and air sealing, but only if applied in multiple coats with proper curing between applications. Windows and doors required special attention to load transfer and moisture control where different materials interfaced. Each detail affected overall performance, making bale construction more demanding of careful workmanship than conventional framing that could tolerate larger margins of error. This system's approach to building performance represented a fundamental departure from conventional construction philosophy that treated walls, roofs, and foundations as separate assemblies connected through standard details. Bale construction demanded integration of structural, thermal, and moisture control functions within a single wall assembly that succeeded or failed as a unified system. Patterson's documentation efforts were part of a broader pattern of technical inquiry that developed throughout 1949 as builders across the Great Plains recognized that conventional methods needed modification for extreme climate conditions. The American Society of Heating and Ventilating Engineers began collecting data on building performance during the winter siege, seeking to understand why some structures maintained comfortable conditions with reasonable fuel consumption, while others failed despite enormous energy inputs. Their findings confirmed what Tom Bentley had demonstrated through practical application. Thermal performance depended on the integrated effects of insulation, air sealing, and thermal mass rather than any single factor. Buildings that combined high insulation values with effective air barriers achieved heating efficiency that couldn't be matched by conventional thin wall construction, regardless of heating system capacity or fuel consumption rates. The broader implications extended beyond individual building performance to regional construction practices and materials utilization. Nebraska produced enormous quantities of prairie grass that were typically burned as waste or left to decompose in fields. Converting this agricultural byproduct into building materials created economic value while reducing dependence on imported lumber from distant timber regions. The environmental benefits weren't clearly understood in 1949 terms, but the economic advantages were immediately apparent to farmers and builders dealing with post-war material shortages and inflated prices. The legacy of bale construction in Nebraska had actually begun decades before the lone oak, during the early settlement period from 1900 through 1935, when timber scarcity forced widespread adoption of alternative building methods. The Sandhills region particularly had embraced bale construction during this era, producing hundreds of residential and commercial buildings that demonstrated the method's durability and practicality under Great Plains conditions. The Pilgrim Holiness Church in Arthur, Nebraska, built in 1927 and 28, represented the most ambitious example of this earlier bale construction wave. The church building measured 40 by 60 feet with a full basement and supported a traditional gable roof structure entirely through bale wall construction. The congregation had chosen bale walls not from architectural preference, but from economic necessity, achieving a permanent church building at roughly half the cost of equivalent lumber construction. 40 years later, the Arthur Church would be listed on the National Register of Historic Places, formally recognizing straw-bale construction as a legitimate building method worthy of preservation and study. The 1979 listing cited the building's significance in demonstrating the ingenious use of indigenous materials in construction, and noted that the structure remained sturdy far beyond expectation, despite decades of Great Plains weather exposure. This official recognition represented the culmination of a gradual shift in understanding about regional building methods and their relationship to local materials and climate conditions. What had been dismissed as primitive improvisation by settlers, too poor or ignorant to build properly, was eventually acknowledged as intelligent adaptation to environmental and economic constraints that conventional building methods couldn't address effectively. The lone oak itself became part of this preservation legacy, though its recognition remained informal rather than official. Travelers on Highway 6 continued to stop at the roadhouse throughout the 1950s and 60s, many drawn by stories of the building that had survived the winter when other structures failed. Tom Bentley and Nola Bailey took quiet satisfaction in the performance vindication, but they never promoted their building as anything more than a practical solution to post-war material shortages and regional climate challenges. The technical lessons learned from bale construction gradually influenced conventional building practices throughout the Great Plains region. Builders began paying more attention to air sealing details, insulation continuity, and thermal bridging effects that had been largely ignored when fuel was cheap and abundant. The integration of thermal performance considerations into construction planning became standard practice rather than an afterthought, driven by the economic and comfort benefits demonstrated during the winter that tested every building method against the unforgiving mathematics of heat loss and fuel consumption. When winter returned each year, the lone oak continued to demonstrate what happened when building design matched climate reality rather than construction convention. The grass house had become simply a well-built house, its methods validated by performance rather than prejudice.